Hi, my name is Alexa, and this is That Wrestling Wench.
Oh, y'all wanted a twist, eh?
OPULENCE. Opulence. You own everything.
Tonight, it will be lights, cameras, so much action.
I hope everybody that's listening is well, and this is finding them in a good place, or an okay one at least. Today's episode is going to be kind of similar to the Jaguar Yokota episode I did a few weeks ago. I'm going to be going over an article that I wrote over at Last Word on Sports. I've been also writing for Pro Wrestling Stories every so often, and I did a lot of research on this subject, so I kind of wanted to throw it into the podcast as well. Today I'm going to be discussing something that truly does mean a lot to me. I'm going to be talking about the intersections between drag and professional wrestling. And one might question, if they're not aware, what do these two things have to do with each other? But really, they're quite similar in their spirit, in their philosophy, in their actions, and I think that if you don't know that yet, you will find that out through this. So I hope you can give me the opportunity to prove it to you. And before I really dive in, I'll give you a short story to lead you in. The article title is Dragon Wrestling, Powder and Paint. And I named it that because my grandmother is this incredibly fabulous woman who worked on a lot of game shows in the 60s and 70s, like Hollywood Squares or Laugh-In. And she worked with a lot of celebrities and knew just a lot of people and is incredibly beautiful. And if anyone's ever interested, maybe I'll talk about her for some reason. But she used to always say to me, powder and paint make you what you ain't. And what God's forgotten, you stuff with cotton. And it just feels apt into both of these industries for that to be the title when those two things are very important to each. And this is really where my article starts. Backstage is a respite, holding a peaceful darkness before reaching the blinding lights. Fans' excited energy is carried into every corner of the theater, and their screaming voices all blend together. Hitting the runway, the performer struts to their mark, and their gait tells the audience exactly who they are. While the hands of fans stretch towards them, they either graze their palm with a smile or brush them away with an eye roll. When the performer sheds their sequin-covered coat, they reveal a skin-tight, bejeweled uniform with stockings, and everyone can feel that the show is about to start. Their hair is used as a weapon, flipping around and creating shapes. Painted faces become blurred from the lights beaming down on them and the sweat on their brow. One might wonder, is this about professional wrestlers or drag queens? From Charles Wright covered in purple satin and furs, to Randy Orton dousing himself in body oil and posing, to how Dustin Rhodes lacquered himself in gold and black to perform a striptease, there are undeniable similarities between these two worlds. Performers in professional wrestling embody their character's gender identity, whether it be masculine, feminine, or non-conforming, in ways that evoke a range of emotions from their audience, including attraction, repulsion, and inspiration. They blend elements of tragedy and comedy seamlessly, often within the same performance. It's striking how similar this is to the art of drag, and yet only one of these industries is facing a current threat. Given the current political climate and the rise of the anti-LGBTQ+ legislation in the United States, it's important to highlight the parallels between drag and professional wrestling. By acknowledging these connections, we can work towards dispelling the fear and misunderstanding that surrounds drag. As our mores around gender have shifted and the queer community has continued to gain tangible rights over the last 15 years, conservatives seem to be doubling down to dehumanize them. Because, let's face it, the fight for anti-drag legislation in the United States is a gossamer thin veil over the far right's true mission to attack transgender people's identities, rights, and personhood. And these bills are reviving a facade that feels as old as time itself. Protect children from X, Y, or Z. And there is a reoccurring through line that echoes from decades past with hysteria that surrounded gay men, stranger danger, HIV, and satanic panic. Right now, this moral panic is being reborn in the legislative actions that impact transgender people all over the United States. And drag queens are enduring a chunk of the repercussions of this fear-mongering. And as fans of wrestling, in response to this level of dehumanization being thrust on queer communities, it is important to accept and celebrate that wrestling is drag. Professional wrestling and drag performance both seek to create spectacles as expressions of art and sport. Both are considered lowbrow entertainment while at the same time are avant-garde, simultaneously feeding off of and into elements of camp. But most importantly, they are both propelled ever forward by fans that stand before them with their hands in the air. Drag specifically is a vast concept that spans hundreds of years, contexts, and cultures. It is so a part of human expression, it's kind of hard to think of something that isn't considered drag. As RuPaul says, we're all born naked and the rest is drag. And while the concept of performing gender seems complex, it is something every person does every day of their life. The truth is that the gender spectrum spans as long as the night sky and as deep as the Mariana Trench. Biological sex has never truly indicated the way a person shows their gender, especially since the binary has shifted and twisted across culture more times than can be recorded. Like that photo of baby Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a dress, gender presentation has historically been subject to the time that somebody lives in. In the world of entertainment and performance, clothing and makeup play a crucial role in expressing gender. Performers don costumes and apply makeup to create a unique look that accentuates their individuality and brings their character to life. And as we all very well know, this practice is common among people, but also showgirls, actors, bodybuilders, influencers, and so many other professions. By donning a signature attire, performers reveal their true selves to their audience. And in wrestling and drag, these elements are particularly important as they contribute to the overall artistic expression of the performer. And even when stripping them of their fineries, both wrestlers and drag queens use their bodies to translate stories live on a stage. The book Performance in Professional Wrestling refers to wrestling as, quote, the business of theater, and drag is in that exact same trade. And this could be because throughout the last 100 years, the pair have been featured in circuses and vaudeville shows where subversion was capitalized, from women's feats of strength to men's demonstrations of beauty. And just like wrestling, drag has been seen throughout history in a vast array of circumstances. Drag has been seen in kabuki theater, old Hollywood movies, Shakespearean-era plays, 1990s club kids, Norwegian black metal, world politics, and, of course, professional wrestling, among so many other fucking things.
Touch this skin, darling. Touch this skin, honey. Touch all of this skin. Okay? You just can't take it.
Gender performance is woven through wrestling, like a film on your hands that can't be washed away. Wrestlers often dub themselves the biggest boy in the room and show off their flexed bodies covered in only a loincloth and saturated in oil like Charles Bronson fighting correctional officers. Wrestling's hypermasculinity, although the norm, is still gender performed for the masses. When looking at fantastical wrestling characters in the United States, Many dolled themselves up in drag for decades without it being labeled as such. For examples, The Undertaker, The Boogeyman, Sting, The Ultimate Warrior, they all relied on paint and clothing, or lack thereof clothing, to help them stand out and show off their personas. The Brood were sleek vampires, with fangs and all. In their white cotton ruffled shirts and leather pants, they were a bloody concoction of Interview with a Vampire and Blade. How drama is that? Glenn Jacobs did drag as Kane for over 20 years, although he would not like you to think that. He leaned into the drama as he and the aforementioned Undertaker acted out a Cain and Abel-inspired storyline of fire, murder, and revenge. And all of this was done while he was wearing a wig that we now refer to as the wet look, black raccoon eyeliner underneath a mask, and wearing incredibly tight spandex. Now, Jacobs is a mouthpiece of right-wing sentiment and supports politicians who want to take rights away from LGBTQIA+ communities. We all live many lives. Both wrestling and drag draw inspiration from the same sources and rely on pop culture references as their driving force, making their similarities very apparent. Old Hollywood starlets, showgirls, film, the fabulosity of the 1970s and 80s game shows, television, and so much more. With these inspirations, the feather, sparkle, and sequin industries are never going to go out of business, especially when professional wrestling and drag are still kicking. And although this might seem like a tangent-ish to some people, I think it's incredibly true. Because the through line in this kind of seems to be camp, which is an exaggerated, flamboyant, satirical, yet somehow sincere type of dress or essence. And from this seminal piece from Susan Sontag, it's called Notes on Camp, I want to give you a quote that kind of encapsulates these two industries very well and what they like to do. Quote, "Camp taste draws on a mostly unacknowledged truth of taste and consists in going against the grain of one's sex. What is most beautiful in virile men is something feminine. What is most beautiful in feminine women is something masculine. Camp taste for the androgynous is something that seems quite different but isn't. It's a relish for the exaggeration of sexual characteristics and personality mannerisms. For obvious reasons, the best examples that can be cited are movie stars. The corny, flamboyant femaleness of women like Jane Mansfield, Gina Lollobrigida, Jane Russell, Virginia Mayo. The exaggerated he-man-ness of Steve Reeves, Victor Mature. And the great stylists of temperament and mannerism like Betty Davis, Barbara Stanwyck, and Tallulah Bankhead." Unquote. I know it's a long quote, but I think it really gets to the core of it. The fascination with luxurious wrestling attire may have originated with Gorgeous George, the prominent wrestler of the 1940s, who I've talked on this show about a bunch. He was known for his impeccably coiffed hair and extravagant floor-length gowns, and everywhere he went, the ornate coats he wore exuded the scent of Chanel No. 5. Many wrestlers took inspiration and leaned into the campy, eccentric pieces of wrestling. Randy Savage wore bright colors, feathers, and hats, and emoted like a telenovela star. Coco Beware carried a parrot to the ring, his hair matching the bird's feathers, while he supported lame and sequins. Ric Flair emerged onto the runway with coats encrusted with rhinestones, diamonds, and crystals. He was inspired by Buddy Rogers and his perfectly bleached hair, and Ric's would glow through the television screen. Flair proudly displayed his wealth to fans, boasting about his cashmere clothing and diamond-studded Rolex watch. There are also clear examples of wrestlers who have purposefully blurred the line between wrestling and drag. While luchadors have been known for their intricacies of their masks and clothing and overall wrestling styles, exoticos are some of the clearest representations of drag in wrestling. They swing to the subversive side of gender expression, and they are the meeting point between the two industries. A 1940s wrestler named Dizzy Davis is considered to be one of the first exoticos in Mexico, and he upset the usual virtues for a wrestler by being primped and pampered by his valet ringside. Now people of varying gender identities perform as exoticos, and the consistent theme for the entertainers is that they see the machismo in wrestling and they blow it a kiss. Adrian Street became the, quote, sadist in sequins, unquote, which is a title of one of Street's autobiographies. He had these white blonde locks that just shone. In the essay King of the Ring and Queen of It Too, its author Greer quotes Street saying he was, quote, a Nancy boy who was tougher than he had any right to be, a confusing spanner in the works of masculinity, unquote. Street refused to play the role of a mere cog in the hypermasculine machine, and in doing so, commanded attention. Someone I imagine everybody has been thinking about as I've been reading this is another Jean Harlow, Marilyn Monroe platinum blonde of wrestling, and his name was Goldust.
Beating you titillates me. It sends goosebumps up and down my curvy spine. And oh yes, I will beat you, President Piper. Believe me, it will be the spanking like you have never had before. You remember the name of Goldust.
His entire essence was a direct inspiration from showgirls, pole dancers, and drag queens, of course. Like Street and the Exoticos, his actions destabilized the gender of those around him. He would wear feather boas with a painted face and would perform stripteases. Goldust once hit the runway in a baby's diaper. Another time he came to the ring clad in leather, walking on all fours like a dog with Luna Vachon as his wrangler. A very intense gender subversion. And to lead really into the modern mixings of these two things, there have been a few wrestling drag queens, promotions, and the such, but none so on the nose as Chokehold, a show based out of New Orleans. The performers were quoted in Pro Wrestling Illustrated as saying Chokehold, quote, places a queer lens on the traditionally machismo world of wrestling, using drag and queer performance to intensify inherently flamboyant and camp elements of professional wrestling, unquote. Through layers of lip-sync performances, playing into their personas and wrestling matches, these entertainers subvert expectations and marry drag and wrestling together in a cocktail that they then splash in your face. And drag queens have definitely been quicker to see the similarities between drag and wrestling. The, of course, popular TV show RuPaul's Drag Race, a competition series, had a challenge in their 4th season called WTF, Wrestling's Trashiest Fighters. And the queens put on a very fun match that is actually pretty impressive when you find out how little training they had. And years later, another contestant on the show, Daya Betty, centered a challenge around her love of wrestling and spoke about how it was a personal and sexual awakening for her. Even one of the most brutal wrestlers of the 1990s has a connection to drag. New Jack was known as someone who went over the edge and could be a frightening presence in a wrestling ring, and some of his more controversial decisions have been reported in Vice docuseries Dark Side of the Ring. And somewhat ironically, his child is a Baltimore-based drag queen who goes by Washington Heights. To quote this Vice article that interviews Heights, she says of her first exposure to wrestling, quote, I was fascinated by the entrance music, the costumes, the flashiness, the big personalities, the fireworks. That's pretty much everything that I'm doing, except drag queens don't slam each other on the floor. No, drag queens slam themselves on the floor. Death drops are horrifying. And when it comes into the real world, there are actual implications for these horrifying anti-drag legislations that are being proliferated throughout the U.S. When it comes to transgender wrestlers, some travel the United States for work. And as of this writing and this podcast episode, 46 out of the 50 states have anti-LGBTQIA plus bills in debate. And those are incredibly dangerous implications. Add to that, there are already massive problems with healthcare in the United States, and the wrestling industry is an example of its issues. Despite being a combat sport, wrestlers are often denied the opportunity for health insurance coverage by their employers due to being classified as independent contractors or work for hires. The independent scene can't afford to provide insurance, and the World Wrestling Entertainment intentionally fights to not have to. With further attempts at healthcare cuts for transgender folks, trans wrestlers have compounded issues forced on them. And the truth is that transgender people are disproportionately the victims of violence. Black trans women and trans women of color especially have been put in dangerous situations by powerful people and the structures that they work within. Overall, there have been blatant attempts to devalue and dehumanize trans people. And for example, their intentions can be seen in the baseless controversy that's stirred up about transgender athletes in the world of sports. And obviously, the repercussions can be felt in the pro wrestling community. Sunny Kiss, Nyla Rose, Edith Surreal, and many other women represent the trans community in the sport of wrestling, and unfortunately, even in All Elite Wrestling, who tries to have an inclusive space for their people. I've been at shows where I have heard audience members say the most disgusting things about women there and the trans woman that works there, Nyla Rose. And the whole world also knows that she's endured transphobia from the audience because there was an incident that prompted security to remove people because of their hateful signs and rhetoric that they were spewing. In early April of this year, at a wrestling convention, Impact wrestler Giselle Shaw reported online that she experienced a verbal assault from WWE Hall of Famer Rick Steiner. His actions toward a fellow wrestler are inexcusable and cruel to somebody who should be protected in that space. Fortunately, Steiner was not permitted to return to the convention the following day because of the incident. And after the verbal attack, Shaw took to Twitter on Trans Day of Visibility, stating that other WWE legends just sat and watched Steiner dehumanize her, and she was not going to let him stifle her, she said. She emphasizes these transphobic acts keep happening when people stand on the sidelines and, quote, do not take any action, unquote. Recently, WWE legend Kevin Nash, on the other side, released a statement saying that Steiner's actions were very wrong. And I think that when people like Nash continue to take action, there can actually be a very tangible change in outcome. And I'm not going to go on for too much longer. And to wrap it up and put a little bow on it, in response to all of this legislation across the United States, previous RuPaul's Drag Race contestant Denali tweeted, quote, "If y'all want to get rid of drag, you got to get rid of WWE." And I think that this rings incredibly true and sums up this whole episode in many fewer words. And as a fan of wrestling, I think it is currently important to see these similarities, and if you don't see them, question why you don't. Professional wrestling and drag have so much in common. They even both transcend the capitalistic philosophy of, quote, just a job. Passion is born, lives, and immortalizes itself within these industries. Similar to their core, the two professions are fringe interests that some people simply just do not understand. And that's not a bad thing. It's not meant for everybody. Drag is an act of gender defiance, actuality, queering, and affirmation, all the while putting on a good show. And with wrestling, there will always be those who cannot absorb the satire, silliness, or rough edges. Even its sweetest parts can be too saccharine for some. But that's okay. They should just get out of the audience and make room for those with their hands in the air. I just wanted this sentiment to be expressed because I think it's important to be protecting trans people in this country right now, and in the face of all of this horrible shit that is attempting to dehumanize and devalue them as human beings. Transgender people are people, and transgender women are women, transgender men are men, non-binary people are non-binary, and I think we should all accept it and celebrate it. And trans people shouldn't have to represent a community. They shouldn't have to represent anything. It's just where we are in this gender political spectrum that we are forcing them to be the representatives of a whole community. But that's just not how it should be. It should be able to just represent yourself, and that's it. And even if you don't want to that day, you shouldn't have to. I don't know. I'm just rambling a little bit now. I just want to say thank you very, very much if you listened through this whole thing. This episode means more to me than a couple of the others, I guess. I don't know. It's just important to me, and I want the point to get across and to resonate, and I hope it does, and I hope it did. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoy the show, please give it a review or whatever on the platform that you decide to listen to your podcasts on. And please join me again. I hope in the next couple weeks to be doing something about kayfabe, and after that, I don't know, we'll see. But thank you very much, and I hope that everybody has an okay week. Thanks, guys. That Wrestling Wench is created and written by me, Alexa Pruitt. The music is by Kreider Dane of Helter Skelter Music Productions, and if you enjoyed yourself, come back. Thank you so much.
Cut. That's a wrap.